So, welcome back to another episode of Making Imagination. I'm Wes, and today I'm here with background designer Mickey Nuspl to talk about background and layouts. So, thanks for joining me, Mickey.
Yeah, no problem. I'm glad to do it.
Cool. So, you and I have worked together on a couple of different projects in actually different aspects, but primarily background designs.
Mhm.
So, I wanted to ask you just kind of questions about your process and things.
Absolutely.
Specifically, how do you approach your backgrounds and layouts, and how do you kind of go into it?
I would say that my first step of figuring out a background is actually to find out the aspects of it. So what I do is I always just start off with grabbing reference photos of, if I want specific items in my picture or my drawing, then I will go ahead and grab a reference photo off of Pinterest, off of Google, find things that fit really well, that have a good color scheme, the right kind of perspective that I'm looking for, and then also similar to the design that I can kind of build off of that. That's where I start off with.
Huh. Interesting. You kind of talked about amongst those things, color scheme being one of those things. And I think color is an interesting sort of language, which kind of makes me curious, how do you go about finding your colors? How do you land on color schemes?
I usually try to stay with figuring out what is the main color of the drawing that I want, and then branching out from there, because that main color sets the mood for the entire piece, or it's the focal part of the scene. So I really want that one color to be the standout and every other color to kind of build upon it, or maybe let that color take the forefront and everything else is kind of behind it. So that's kind of where I start out. I tend to try and do a lot of color schemes like analogous or triadic. I can't remember all the names right now, but I tend to do a lot of I don't do complementary, but the ones that are on three, like along the same line. So like blue, purple, green around in there, or red, orange, pink, all in that area. I tend to do a little bit of that and then find one that's a little bit out from there and that make that the focal of the scene. Another thing that I like to do is that I try to stick with colors that aren't necessarily true to what we say they are. So I don't really tend to use true blues unless they're a really strong color I'm looking for, or true purples. I like to find things that are in between that aren't as used as often. And I also tend to stay away from things that are super saturated unless the scene calls for it. I tend to stay more towards somewhere in the middle, not super desaturated, but not super saturated either. Again, unless it's a focal point, then I'm okay with going in with a very strong color, and then everything else kind of takes a background to that.
Huh. Yeah, I have this book, The Noble Approach. It's about Maurice Noble, background designer and things, and just looking at the color wheels and things and the examples and that he has in there. I can't believe the things you can do with color schemes and all the different things that I would just never think to do. So that's interesting. You just hearing you talk about the different color schemes that you like to lean into and choose from.
Right. Colors are such a great way to develop not only like areas that you're in, but also your characters as well. So, if you've got a background piece that's very character heavy, totally tie those colors into with your character and then build upon that so it creates character development. A lot of people think that background design doesn't play into building your characters or building your world sometimes, especially when it's just everyday mundane scenes, but it really truly does. And it can reveal tons about your show, your character, whatever you're doing.
Oh, that's interesting. That's cool. So I know just from working with you, I've seen a couple of different of your styles, and I've also worked with you on a couple of different projects. Some of them more grounded, others less grounded in kind of reality. Some of them more fantastical. What are some of the styles you enjoy exploring as an artist, as a background designer?
If we're talking about art styles, I started off working with you and doing like really these lineless art styles that I still really, really enjoy. You don't really see them a lot, you don't see them very often on TV shows. A lot of it's very lined, and that's fine. It just depends on what you're using for your show. So I tend to lean towards that because I really like that. And also it's great to use that to build upon creating more painterly type scenes. I also really like working with line pieces too. That's just fine. But I really like creating scenes that are very fantastical. And that's why I like doing the lineless style, because I think that kind of plays into that a little bit too. Gives it a little bit more fluidity.
Yeah, that's interesting. You mentioned kind of enjoying to do kind of fantastical things and whimsical things. What kinds of worlds do you like to explore when you're doing backgrounds? Do you prefer to do kind of more whimsical, fantastical, or do you prefer to do the more ordinary, you might find this in real life kind of a background?
I think the things that I like to enjoy the most, I do love creating fantastical scenes because they create these really beautiful color schemes. But as I said earlier, talking about character development with background scenes, I personally love creating character heavy spaces. So bedrooms, family rooms, offices, things that characters live in. I like really figuring out what needs to be in there, what's really telling about these characters. And I also think that those scenes are really, really fun for hiding Easter eggs, which is a personal favorite of mine. You'll see them on popular TV shows like Disenchantment has a couple of them. I know The Simpsons has some great Easter eggs hidden in their backgrounds.
That's interesting. Is it about world building for you in terms of what draws you to background and layout? Is it about expanding? I guess, what is it about designing backgrounds that attracts you to it?
I think it's world building that really I find really enjoyable about it, because I personally, when I started off in my animation degree, I only drew characters. I was one of those people that filled their sketchbooks up with their personal characters. I had like a million OCs, and I would draw them in almost the same exact position. I was obsessed with drawing them, but it was fun for me, and I never did backgrounds. So once I started doing backgrounds and getting into that kind of mode of drawing, I realized that there's just so much that goes into it that I didn't even think of, that you can totally expand upon and create more different things. And it just became a passion of mine to get into, that and eventually just started into, wow, I love drawing these backgrounds that are character heavy, but I also love figuring out how to draw things like trees and rocks, and how to draw space, that kinds of stuff. I started getting into perspective, and even though it's incredibly hard to do, it's a challenge for me, then a challenge that I enjoy. So that's kind of why I keep going with it.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, it seemed you seem to take to backgrounds, I think, pretty well, and pretty quickly. I don't know when I met you, where you were in that journey, but it seemed you seem to do it, take to it pretty well, pretty naturally. Is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I had done some backgrounds for personal projects of mine, or school projects, I'll say that, especially for like my senior overview. I designed those backgrounds and had some help with those. But when I started out at Coolfire, when I sent you that test background that I did, that looking back on it, wow, I'm not a fan of it. That was my first official background that I actually did. And seeing my growth from there to the end of my internship to where I am now, it's just incredible. And I just kind of want to keep the train going.
Oh, that is amazing. That's amazing. Yeah, I've noticed about your work, you have a natural sort of whimsy, a natural kind of flavor and feel, which is appealing to me. I think you bring some charm to the way you draw trees, the way you draw rocks, and I think it's really fun.
Thank you.
Yeah. So that kind of leads me to my next question, which is, where do you draw inspiration? Are there other artists you look to? Are there shows you look to that for those kinds of ideas?
I think the shows that really inspired me, especially when I was getting into animation as a career in terms of like going into school, I really liked Star versus the Forces of Evil. They had this really great background art that was lineless and had some really great textures in it that really drew me to it. It was the show that made me say, wow, I really want to go to school for that. Because originally I was in animation and then I was going to drop out and go and be an English major. And then I saw that show and I said, if I don't work on something like that, I'm going to be kicking myself for the rest of my life. So I came back to it. So I look at their backgrounds because they're incredible. I also really like the backgrounds for Tangled the series. They're very beautiful. They've got this lineless style with great texture. I kind of have a theme going on here, but I also do like other shows that have more line styles. Adventure Time is a big one for me. I really love their lined backgrounds. The way that they draw trees specifically in my brain, I think is very interesting. How they approach shadowing and lighting is a little bit different than what I would normally do, but I love the way that they're able to do it. I like the backgrounds of Rick and Morty. I think they've got a really great style too, kind of a little bit more grungy, but it's a really different style that I very much enjoy. Another one I really like is Bob's Burgers. And also The Great North, the new show that was with their style, how they draw their lines, how they kind of approach their backgrounds.
It's funny you mentioned even there are different ways of doing different backgrounds. Oh, I recently saw Cartoon Saloon's Wolf Walkers. I don't know if you've seen that one. It's a masterpiece. To do what they did took an incredible amount of talent, but they are looser in terms of the color spills out over the lines, deliberately so. And it has this wonderful effect on the whole thing. And the way they use colors in the backgrounds is quite incredible. It's really, really something, particularly if you read through the Art of book and kind of see some of the insights that went into those decisions and really quite spectacular. It was funny too. I wanted to follow up too. You mentioned the show that kind of reinvigorated your passion for animation. For me, I've always wanted to go into animation. I've never really wanted to do anything else, but the movie that sort of solidified that, and I came out of and saying, "Holy cow, yes, that's what I want to do." Was the second How to Train Your Dragon. I walked out of that theater and I thought, I want to work for that guy. That was just an amazing experience.
Right. I also felt that way about Cartoon Saloons. Their first one, Secret of the Kells, and later Song of the Sea. Those were two movies that I watched before I watched like Secret of the Kells before I got into animation. That was the first one that made me say, wow, you can really do some amazing things. You don't have to just stick to the status quo when it comes to doing background designs, because their backgrounds were so intricate and beautifully done. It's incredible the things that you can do with the backgrounds and not take away from what's going on in the animation.
Yeah, and that's a tricky balance. I've heard people say people shouldn't notice the background. It's there to sort of support the characters, and it really is. But I really do think that backgrounds can and sometimes should make a statement as well.
Oh, absolutely.
Mickey, this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you so much for joining me. It's been great.
Thank you for having me. I'm very glad to talk about what I do.